Welcome, and thank you all for coming. My name is Dean Reuter. I'm Vice President of the Federalist Society. Thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Federalist Society's 4th Annual Executive Branch Review Conference. And a special welcome to those of you joining us via the internet. 4 years ago now, when we hosted the first Executive Branch Review Conference, we were warned about calling it the first annual conference. But we were determined to send a clear, strong signal that the Federalist Society's practice groups were intent on examining the growth and effect of the regulatory apparatus of the government, especially the executive branch, and doing so for a long time to come. And so here we are. In addition to our 4 annual conferences, we've hosted and will continue to host numerous standalone programs covering virtually every executive branch topic you can imagine. We've also used teleforum conference calls, student and lawyers chapter programs, Hill programs and briefings, and countless scholarly articles. Our work, of course, like the Washington rain, continues. And a special announcement I want to make today. Today we are using this forum, the Executive Branch Review Conference Forum, to announce and launch a brand new project of the Federalist Society. It is the Federalist Society's Law and Innovation Project. It is a years-long study by the Federalist Society of whether and how laws and regulations at all levels of government, so think federal, state, and local, how those laws and regulations affect innovation, entrepreneurship, and the larger economy. We've received a generous grant that will allow us to host annual law and innovation conferences, teleforums, and other programming here in Washington and throughout the country. We'll be producing short videos as well as a feature-length documentary and a series of white papers and even a book, all with an eye to examining the interaction between laws, regulations, rules of all kinds, and innovation. We've even got staff dedicated exclusively to the project. Newly hired attorney Devin Westhill, he's deputy director of the project. Devin, if you could stand. And Associate Director Caroline Moore, who joins us, the Law and Innovation Project from the Student Division. So please introduce yourselves to them throughout the day to learn even more about this new project. For now, we've got a full day of programming with important addresses, plenary sessions, and breakout sessions as well, and I hope you'll stick around for that full day and join us for the closing reception. We begin today by an address by U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. Elected in 2012 in that election cycle's closest Senate race, she's earned a reputation for reaching across the aisle to find common ground. She's earned a reputation, refreshingly, for striking positions that seem in the best interest of her constituents rather than favoring other considerations. I fear for your long-term future in Washington, D.C. with that attitude, but welcome you. I'm tempted to give her a more generous introduction that she deserves, but I'd rather give more time for her remarks. She needs to leave us before 10 o'clock. So she's going to speak to us for about 10 minutes, then take some questions from our panelists, then maybe questions from the audience, but after that, our panel will ensue, to be moderated by our good friend Adam White. With that, please join me in welcoming Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you. I think most of you are Lutherans. You're not filling up the front seat. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've long been curious about your organization, and as a person who began her career in state government, I am pretty jealous about protecting the 10th Amendment. I am concerned about the level of preemption, concerned about what that means for innovation, what that means for kind of this great laboratory that we say are the 50 states, and so it's not without some interest that I come here, interest in you, and you not in me. I want to begin with a couple stories, and there's stories from when I was Attorney General. Some of you may know that before I was Attorney General in North Dakota, I was also the tax commissioner, and so I dealt with regulation on a regular basis, and frequently, and maybe ironically, was criticized when I was tax commissioner that I didn't promulgate enough rules. So just so that you all who are worried about promulgation of rules, just remember, frequently those rules that we direct agencies to promulgate frequently have real consequences when they're not promulgated as well. But when I ran for Attorney General, we have something called charitable gaming in North Dakota. This is $2 blackjack. It's played in bars and restaurants. It's run by charities, and the proceeds go to support the charity. We had a responsibility within the Office of Attorney General to regulate charitable gaming. And so everywhere I went when I was campaigning, I heard about these horrible, horrible regulations involving charitable gaming. You know, that they were just unmanageable, unruly, way overboard. And so when I got elected, I called down the guy who was the regulator for charitable gaming, and I said, bring down those regulations when you come down. So he came downstairs. He was up on the 17th floor. I was on the first. Came down, and they were regulations at least this thick for $2 blackjack. Okay. And I said, you know, Chuck, let's open this up. And I just randomly opened it up and I said, why did you write this regulation? He said, because somebody up in somewhere, some small town did something he didn't like. And I opened it up. Why did you write this regulation? Same thing. I said, you know, Chuck, just as diligently as you have pursued these regulations, I want you to be equally diligent in giving me a set of regulations that people will actually read, because when they're this thick, people don't read them, and that are essential to doing your job, but no more. You cannot regulate a perfect world. You cannot regulate honesty. You've got to set out the rules of the road, but you also have to be ready to act responsibly, you know, when you're putting these things together. And so he came back, and what was this turned into 70 pages, simply by being told, that's too much. Give me what is essential. You know what? There was no more cheating after we did that in charitable gaming than there was before we did that. And so it does inform that with the right kind of scalpel, with the right kind of innovation, with the right kind of direction, we can, in fact, pare down this morass of regulations that we have. We can, in fact, change the outcome and reduce the volume, if not the overall kind of impact. I'm also going to, on the other side, I'm going to tell you another story. Became Attorney General, and they were in the process of writing regulations on advertising standards. Okay, so the states also have truth in advertising laws, and the Attorney General had the responsibility of consumer protection, and so we were writing advertising rules that said, we don't care what the manufacturer's suggested price is. If you never sell anything at the manufacturer's suggested price, you can't advertise that as the price of the product. You know, that this is a facade. This is nonsense. And so, you know, 70% off the manufacturer's suggested price probably was really a 5% reduction from what they, on average, would sell the product. And so, as you can imagine, the furniture stores were quite upset, and they came in and they said, this isn't right, you know, this is the price that the manufacturers give us, this is overreach on your part. I said, that's fine. I said, that's fine. I'll eliminate all the regulation. They kind of looked at me. I said, I'm serious. I'll eliminate all the regulation, but I'm going to take out a half-page ad every Sunday in the paper saying, believe nothing that you read in the advertising section today, because it's not regulated. The problem that we have in America is we have told consumers, we've got your back. We have told investors, we've got your back. We have told all these people that they don't have to do due diligence in analyzing their own situation, because there's a regulation that's going to prevent you from ever experiencing harm. And believe it or not, the people who are regulated, they enjoy some satisfaction from that, right? Because of course I do it. If I didn't, they'd stop me. Of course I can, you know, offer you these payday loans at outrageous interest rates, because if it was illegal, I couldn't do it. Of course you can buy this product that says you can lose 20 pounds in 2 days, because it would be illegal for me to say otherwise. Common sense would suggest that maybe we shouldn't buy into all of this. But it's a tricky balance in regulation. It's a tricky balance in trying to figure out at what point do you not try and regulate a perfect world, but at what point do you walk away and say, buyer beware? I mean, that's kind of your group, buyer beware, right? I mean, that people have to take some responsibility for their own decision-making in life. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but as long as we have boundaries that we don't even think about, as a structural matter, if you get what I'm saying, as long as we don't know where the lane is in terms of what the expectation is on the consumer, never mind finding the lane between state and federal, or finding the lane between executive and legislative, if we don't have those lanes well defined, then no one's happy. And so, it takes me back to a discussion we had in banking. We were having a hearing on bitcoins. Okay, bitcoins, are they currency? What are they? Should they be regulated? How are they being used in the marketplace? How are they being used for evil on the dark net, which they are? And so there was like this kind of foregone conclusion from everybody on the committee that we ought to be doing something to regulate bitcoins. When it got to be my turn to question, I said, why are we having this discussion? Just tell everybody in the country that if you operate using bitcoins, there is no guarantee behind that. You act at your own peril. If you want to buy something at a Bitcoin doesn't have any value when you get it, that's your problem. It's not the government's problem, and it's not the state's problem, it's not the regulator's problem. So why are we, if we are going to get into regulating Bitcoins, then you better figure out what you're going to do. Otherwise, stay away from it, because the confusion that will ensue will actually have, I think, more dramatic and drastic consumer results, because once again, the consumer will probably be misled and believe that they, in fact, do not have, or that be misled and think that they're protected, that Bitcoins somehow are regulated. And so, at some point here, the first question that we ought to ask is not whether it belongs in the state government or the federal government, whether it's an executive action or a legislative action. The first question that we always should ask is, why are we doing it to begin with? Why are we in the regulatory business to begin with? And so, it's a question that very seldom gets asked in Washington, D.C. And it's a question that also doesn't get asked very often in state government. Why is that? Because when somebody has a bad outcome, politicians want to fix it. And when somebody has a really bad outcome, we name whatever the fix is for them, right? Yeah, I mean, it's somebody's law. If something bad happened to that person and it's outrageous and it runs for a week on CNN, we all feel compelled to do something about it. So the first question doesn't get asked very often, which is, why are we doing this? But the second question to me is, who should be doing it? Should it be state government? Should it be a local government? Should it be the federal government? And I will tell you, one of the things that doesn't get discussed at all, in spite of my repeated requests to talk about it, is the duplication between local and state and federal regulation. You're going to start this project looking at innovation. I would suggest to you that state regulation has just as much to do with reducing and confusing potential entrepreneurs. And local regulation can be just as onerous. We're seeing that right now with labeling, GMO labeling. It's interesting because it's like, there's a crisis because Vermont passed a law. I said, well, is that really a crisis? That's not about us. We didn't pass that law. Well, we have to preempt it because we can't have 50-state solution, which I kind of agree with. But it's really interesting how, depending upon who in that discussion between state and federal, who really is the consistent Federalist, right? I'll tell you one person who I think is a consistent Federalist, it's Rand Paul. He's voting against any kind of preemption. Good for him. That's, you know, I don't know that that's the right answer, because we also have an obligation under the Commerce Clause to ease interstate commerce. It was one of the great failures of the Articles of Confederation, is the lack of cross-border commerce. And so, you know, we've got to balance it all. But the second question is, who's best equipped to make the decision? Do we need national standards? And then the third question is, how, when we're looking at this, how descriptive has the federal government or the Congress been to the regulated? You know, I'm going to give you two examples, and then we'll turn it over to the work that James Langford and I are doing on reg reform stuff. But I'm going to give you, because these are kind of fundamental questions. This is the framework in which I look at things. So when you go back and you take a look at waters of the United States, hugely controversial rule, especially in a state like mine that has a lot of what we call prairie potholes. If any of you are duck hunters, say thank you to every farmer in North Dakota for maintaining the wetlands that allow those ducks to fly to your state, if it's Arkansas, or fly wherever you hunt ducks. And so waters of the United States has been in and out of the courts for how many years? At least 20. We've gotten 2 decisions for the Supreme Court. The last one, Capanos, which basically came down 4-4 and 1. And you know what the regulators are trying to do? Accommodate the one Supreme Court justice who concurred but wrote a separate opinion with the majority. It's not going to work. And it doesn't work because things change and our understanding of hydrology changes. And there is a certain dynamic feature to legislation. But 20 years in and out of the court, no certainty, unfettered, unfettered agency called EPA who says this is the way it's going to be. And I dare you, Congress, to change it. So we do things like pass congressional resolutions of disapproval, and the president vetoes them, and we don't get certainty to the American business people. And so along with Senator Inhofe and Senator Donnelly, we've introduced, and Senator Barrasso, we've introduced legislation that would define what waters are and tell them specifically, this is the parameters, you can write rules within those parameters. That has no chance. We got 58 votes in the Senate. The House probably would take it way to the extreme and say you have to be able to float a battleship before it's waters of the United States, right? I mean, so these are the extremes. Yeah, duck lands in it, therefore it's waters of the United States, and let's define waters for jurisdictional purposes as floating a battleship. Neither one of those are going to work. Neither one of them create any kind of reasonable interpretation of what is, in fact, jurisdictional waters under the Clean Water Act. But the problem is that as long as politicians can rail against the evil EPA, and they can rail against the evil polluter and stand up but not take responsibility for fixing this problem, we don't get any certainty. I've never, I mean, you know, and maybe North Dakota is unique. People ask me, what was the major difference coming to Washington from North Dakota? I said, you know, in North Dakota, we actually believe in resolving controversy. We actually believe in solving problems and moving on, and if we make mistakes, we're willing to admit it and go back and readjust. I mean, almost my whole career, I worked with the Republican legislature, and we're able to do some pretty good things, especially in open records, but for law enforcement, for consumer protection. But in Washington, D.C., no one wants to take responsibility because it's easier to write mean letters and say, I'm doing something. I recently received an award from a group, and it was on an issue that is as of yet resolved. I said, Washington, D.C. is the only place where you get an award for trying. Right? It's true. You know, oh, you've been so helpful. Well, we haven't gotten anything done yet. The other one is Clean Power Plan. Clean Power Plan is complicated by the fact that EPA for years said we are not going to assert jurisdiction over CO2. Right? And then Massachusetts case came, and the Supreme Court said, you have to consider whether CO2 is a pollutant. They didn't say it was a pollutant. They said you have to consider whether it's a pollutant. Administration changes. Now we have something called Clean Power Plan that is a regulatory nightmare for states. It is a jurisdictional nightmare, and it flies in the face of states' rights, in my opinion. North Dakota has I think it's one of the few places in the country where there is no non-attainment areas in terms of clean air. We obviously send a lot of CO2 into the air. But so let's look at the impact of CO2 regulations. And I'm not a climate denier. I think that we have a problem with CO2 emissions. I think the solutions that are being proposed are irrational. We cannot, in 2 years, move off fossil fuels. I will tell you this with a great deal of certainty. I used to sit on a board of directors where there was responsibility for putting electrons in the wire. If you shut down coal tomorrow and then shut down natural gas, because that's also a fossil fuel, you shut off the lights in America. And when you do it too quickly, and people say, well, we've got wind and solar. I said, have you ever seen wind energy go on the grid? Well, no, it just goes on. I said, really? You think it's that simple? It's intermittent. And you have to regulate it. And the truth of the matter is we're regulated or we're built to the peak. Now, could we get efficiencies? Sure. So Clean Power Plan doesn't take into consideration any of those efficiencies. It doesn't, it simply says that we're going to move off coal. There's no doubt about it, and sooner rather than later. So what has this meant? And this goes back to the decisions you make and the things that you study. Take a look at what happens when people don't engage in discussion and polarize themselves. When the coal industry, and I've spent a lot of years working with my coal industry, I actually served on a board of directors of a Dakota Gas, which is a one-of-a-kind synfuels plant. We make synthetic natural gas out of lignite coal. And we also sequester CO2 and send it north for enhanced oil recovery. So it's a pretty kind of amazing product. So when the coal industry came in, they said, well, you've got to help us. I said, you have my vote. You have my concern, you have my work. But if you want my leadership, you can't be hell no. Because as they say in Texas, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And you haven't been on the table in this dialogue for a long time, and you have been on the menu. You're now endangered. And you can see what's happening with the coal industry. And you can rail against the regulation, but there also has to be some participation. There has to be some active, I'm just going to oppose it because it's against my religion. I said, I don't care if it's against your religion. You can't be hell no. And now we're playing catch up. Now we're trying to figure out how we deal with the dramatic situation that we're in a way that guarantees all of the above includes coal. And we are 20 years late to that game because people didn't engage. And so I would tell you that regulation has real consequences, that regulation is multi-layered. The first foundational question would be, why are you even engaged? And if you make a decision that we ought to be engaged, then who ought to do it? And if you make a decision that it's the federal government, how should it be done? And what role does Congress play? So everybody who bemoans the overreach of government, the overreach of regulation, there's a fix to overreach. It's called the United States Congress. But the United States Congress is woefully inadequate in responding to overreach except for, writing a letter or introducing a bill. Nobody wants to actually solve these problems. It's not in their political best interest to solve these problems. And I think that's true for coal. I think it's one of the reasons why we're struggling with coal, because there's a whole lot of people who have decided coal's done and it's a better political issue than it is an issue to resolve. And so for our purposes, we look on the committee at this whole array of issues. But what we're trying to do is fundamentally get the lane between the executive branch and the legislative branch better defined. Get the participation and the oversight better defined. And so the series of regulatory changes that Susan can outline for you or that you may know about, they continue to move through. We're in a spot right now in Congress that we have fewer days left. You know, there's more days behind us than there are ahead of us, at least until the election. The election is continuing to dominate kind of the discussion, and it is a time for, you know, if you said, will something happen before the election on reg reform, I'd say it's highly doubtful. Can something happen after the election on reg reform? I'd say that is possible. One final thought, I tell my colleagues all the time, think about this in terms of reg reform. Think about this as the administration of President Donald Trump. Don't think about President Barack Obama. Think about President Donald Trump. What would your ideas be in terms of reg reform if it were President Donald Trump? These should be agnostic, these changes. And I think that's one thing that gets forgotten, because the party that's in power in the White House feels like they have the super legislative branch called regulation. And as a result, we don't do what I think was intended by our wonderful Constitution in terms of knowing which lane you should be in. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions you all have. I think the panel's going to ask.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. Before we move to audience questions, we have three very accomplished and expert panelists, each of whom has prepared a question. Let me begin with Susan Dudley. Susan is the director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. She's had a very accomplished career, including service as administrator of the White House
One of the good ones.
Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Susan?
Okay, well, I actually now have two questions for Senator Heitkamp. The first is, will you run for president?
No.
All right, well, then my second one is a little more mundane. One of the three bills that you and Senator Lankford have put forth together, co-sponsored, would require regulatory agencies to comply with the procedures that every president since Reagan has established. So that is, conduct some regulatory analysis before you issue the regulation and base that regulation on that analysis, including maximizing the net benefits. Why do you think, it just seems common sense that every president has done it, why do you think that's facing some resistance?
I think it faces resistance because of how it's perceived with judicial review. Mm-hmm. So they think, okay, this thing's going to be fraught with gotcha, and as long as it's just an executive order, it doesn't carry the weight and authority of law, therefore is it really something that's reviewable and subject to review by the court. And so I think it's this idea that this is another square corner, you know, turn square corners, and if you don't, you're going to get knocked off. I have not had a chance to digest the MetLife case. I don't know if any of you have, with a SIFI designation, but there is a whole lot in there in terms of you know, kind of expectations about benefit cost analysis and trying to figure out what was actually intended by the Congress and what was required by law. But I think fundamentally, Susan, the real problem is that if you said you maybe can do this, you'd get it passed. But if you say you shall do it, then people see this as yet another avenue for challenging regulations that would end up in the court. Now, I'm sure probably a view shared by many here, the court isn't very rigorous in terms of, not my view, your view probably, I shouldn't project it on you, but that the court isn't very rigorous in their review of federal regulation anyway, so what's to worry about? But we will continue to have this discussion. I think it's fundamental. I think it's foundational, and if it was good for all of these administrations, it really ought to be the law. It's been tested now, it hasn't created all these problems, and it will create a reasonable expectation in terms of what that process is going to look like. So, and on the other side, people would say, well, if every president did it, why do you need a law changing it? And I just think that we need to have a more definitional participation. We need to be clearer in terms of what the Congress's expectations are and not the executive expectations.
Thank you. Well, speaking of SIFI designations, our next question comes from Michael Fitzpatrick of General Electric Company. He serves as Senior Counsel and Head of Regulatory Advocacy at GE, and before that served as Associate Administrator of OIRA. Michael?
Thank you. And we will test the proposition of whether, if you sell a $200 billion business, you can actually remove yourself from SIFI designation. We are the canary in the coal mine. So, Senator, before I served as the number 2 in OIRA during the Obama administration, I was also there in the mid-90s in the Clinton administration, when there were also many battles over reg reform, many of which are also echo what the same discussions we see today. And I think one of the lessons I've learned is that it's really damn hard to get reg reform legislation passed. You've just answered part of my question, which is, what do you think the prospects are for reg reform legislation in this session? And I think you said not until after the election in all probability. Could you then perhaps give us a little bit more of your thoughts on how one could find a path to passage in Congress, whether or not it's this fall or next year? Tell us, in your mind, what you think are the forces that need to come together to allow Congress to pass even what I would call modest, reasonable reg reform proposals.
Well, let me kind of tell a story. I've been part of a group on the banking committee, as you know, trying to figure out, what changes we need to make to Dodd-Frank. And, I don't think anything's perfect. I don't think it's going to be perfect after the process that you go through in legislation. I think that there should be no holy grails. But yet, somehow, Dodd-Frank has, you can't touch it, you can't touch it, you can't touch it, in spite of all evidence that would suggest that both sides could come to some kind of compromise. So put that off to the side. I also have been very involved with a working group on reg reform, systemic reg reform. And so working these two processes, meeting with people, sitting down, narrowing the funnel of ideas down to what is we can get done and will actually have meaning, not something that looks good, but something that actually does good. And before we even said anything publicly about the work product, we had an editorial in the New York Times suggesting that we were handing the keys to the financial institutions back to Wall Street.
Yeah, that happened twice, actually.
Yeah. So
3 years ago as well.
So I'm telling you that the political environment on both sides is toxic for actually having compromise discussions. Can be toxic, and so it requires a certain intestinal fortitude to hang in there. It also probably helps that I'm from a state that has an expectation that this is the work that I'm supposed to be doing. I'm from a red state, and so there isn't political risk to me. No one's going to primary me. I mean, trust me. If they do, I go, whoa, done. Now that I said that, I'm sure somebody's going to primary me. But people operate in different political environments, and when the institutional belief on I would say on the liberal side is that this is rolling back the Obama administration's reforms and Congress's reforms, that's a tough thing to get over because, as I've said in Washington, it's a fact-deficient place, right? It operates on ideology, not facts, which is one of the things that we're dealing with now with not having an XM bank that has a quorum. We can't do deals over 10 million. You may not like the XM Bank, but Congress voted for it. And so the other way is to look at other ways that you can create dysfunction within institutions. And that's really what it is. It's about, you know, I don't want you to even have the discussion, because if you have the discussion, it might just make sense, right? So you can't even sit down in a room without criticism. Now, on the other side, there is a sense of distrust that permeates all of what happens in Washington. What do I mean by that? If we do reg reform, or if we do Dodd-Frank, it'll just be the beginning, and these people will swoop in and they'll take the process and they'll eliminate the, you know, the agencies, and they'll eliminate all the work that was done in Dodd-Frank. It's just a slippery slope argument. So you've got to find people with the intestinal fortitude to actually sit down and do the work, and you have to find people who are reasonable. I think that where James would write, if he were king, James Langford would write a completely different reg reform proposal than I would. But we see our job, you know, after numerous, I mean, our subcommittee has had more hearings, I think, almost than the full committee. Pretty close. Yeah, on regs, for sure. But if you look at, I think it's been the most active subcommittee in Congress or in the Senate. And that's because we believe in what we're doing. We believe in compromise. And so we'll continue to fight this fight. And I expect that next Congress, either he'll be chairman and I'll be ranking, or I'll be chairman and he'll be ranking. We aren't giving up. And so, but I would tell you that two things. Number one, the ideological left and right don't like compromise, and so you don't get things done, and then there's no trust. So the minute you see an erosion of kind of, you know, you're in it, and all of a sudden the ground starts moving and you get editorials, people get a little chilled.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll have one more panelist question, but before that, I just want to mention there will be time for a couple of audience questions. There's a microphone in the middle of the room, so if anybody has a question, the senator does have to leave.
Okay.
Sorry?
He's just giving me the hook here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, 9:40.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, then, if,
Well, we can just take,
Cancel the audience
if there's a couple audience questions, I'll try and be shorter in terms of my answers.
Jeff, you want to, really quick, Jeff?
Senator, if I can jump in be part of the audience on this one?
Yeah.
Michael was referencing some reforms from the 1990s, of which a really significant one was thought to be the Congressional Review Act. And you alluded to in your, what I thought were very insightful remarks, appreciate those, that you had supported several resolutions of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act, but they died on the president's desk. And so I was interested in going forward, what do you think about the Congressional Review Act's potential for imposing more discipline and accountability on both the executive branch and Congress? And perhaps apart from the Congressional Review Act, are there other things that would give Congress a stronger role?
You know, that whole process has been, you know, okay, this is a newcomer's kind of view. I don't know if I can still call myself a newcomer. 3.5 years, I think it's fair to call myself a newcomer. But a newcomer's perspective on this is that it's all about messaging. This isn't about actually controlling anything. It's again about going back to your constituent group saying, see what I did, see what I did. You know, I got this congressional, you know, I voted for this. Well, that's not resolving the controversy. And you know, given that it takes, you know, 2/3 of the Congress to override a veto, it's not likely that it's ever going to have real consequences. And so does it have an impact on the courts when they look at it? When, you know, let's take Clean Power Plan, that was one that passed, Waters of the United States. Will the DC Circuit Court actually look at those things as they're deliberating on, do they have Waters or Clean Power Plan? They have one of those too. Anyway, I think Clean Power Plan. And you know, I don't know. I mean, they probably argue they don't, just because they have to look at the record in front of them. But you know, it does, I think, in many ways, it can be polarizing for compromise. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, we disapprove of this, well, yeah, but what's your answer? And we never get to the yeah, but what's your answer? And so where I will continue to vote for resolutions of disapproval, I don't know that they have any real impact in the real world. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
My name is Carl Domino. I'm from South Florida, and I'm running for Congress. As you might imagine, many of my potential constituents are elderly. And inevitably, you get a question about the cost of medications. I've done enough to know that the average new drug is about a $2.2 billion investment and probably 8 to 10 years for the approval process. There's a drug that's up now that would treat Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. There's no issue whatever on its safety, and the company is a relatively small company, and for various reasons could not do a double-arm study. They only could do a study on 12 patients. 10 of those patients 4 years later can walk, which is remarkable. At the advisory committee meeting a few weeks ago, the head of the committee said there's 2 mistakes the Drug Administration can make. One is to approve a drug that's a bad drug, and 2, to not approve a drug that's safe but efficacy. Is there some way we can put a hole in the $2.2 billion per new drug and still have a safe drug regulation procedure?
Well, I think you know that Congress over the many years has tried to get at this balance between making sure that you do no harm, which is fundamentally the first important role that people have, but also making sure that when things are desperate, that people have access, not grasping at straws, but have access to innovation. It's a tough balance. Because the last thing I think that again, our history informs our decision making, right? And when you approve drugs that have side effects and bad consequences, kind of long term, then you get a little gun shy. We're seeing this with FAA and drones and unmanned aircraft. They're having a heck of a time trying to balance their safety mission with the responsibility that they have to, kind of allow this new innovation into the airspace. One of the things that I think would not be helpful is Congress intervening drug by drug. I think we need to set some broad overarching rules, but I share your concern about the rising cost of drugs. I also share the concern of pharma that, look, we've got to recoup our costs. So at what point do you kind of balance this in terms of greatest good for the greatest number? I will tell you this, when you look at the numbers, as a potential congressman, when you look at the numbers and you see that big red debt that's coming at us, most of that is Medicaid and Medicare, and most of that, the majority of that's going to be the high cost of prescription drugs. And so we have to begin to address this problem. Yeah, one more question, then I'm out.
Senator Heitkamp, thank you so much for your leadership in trying to make regulatory reform bipartisan. I know it's difficult. My question is, we haven't really gotten the public engaged in some of these technical issues, and perhaps I'd be interested in your view about whether or not an issue that might motivate the public is whether or not regulations like laws should actually have the consent of the governed. And of course, there's one philosophy that regulators are smarter than everybody else, and so they should be able to dictate, and another philosophy that because we have to live under these regulations, they really ought to have the approval of the legislative branch. And as you know, in North Dakota, all of the executive branch regulations have to be approved or at least go through a review process from the legislature. And the North Dakota legislature passed a resolution urging Congress to propose something called the Regulation Freedom Amendment, which would simply require that major new federal regulations be approved by Congress. And there are now 19 state legislative chambers around the country that have urged Congress to propose that amendment. The American Farm Bureau supports it. And I wondered if you'd thought about the possibility of joining that movement to really make regulators accountable to elected officials, which might force Congress to be accountable for all of these regulations that they like to give speeches opposing, but maybe don't really want to vote on.
I think before we add another layer of complexity onto regulation, I think there's plenty of avenues for oversight that Congress has that they don't exercise already. And so what you're proposing, and just to be clear, where the Reg Committee in North Dakota can review regulations, they can't repeal them. They have to do that in the next legislative session. So they can't disapprove, they can vote to disapprove them, but it doesn't eliminate the regulation. And that goes back to a whole series of jurisprudence that you guys probably know better than I do in terms of, what was the case Supreme Court decided in terms of, pardon?
Chada.
Yeah, and so you have to look at all of this kind of in that context, in that framework. But my problem is that frequently the most injurious and overreaching regulations involve ambiguity in law that Congress isn't willing to straighten out. Take waters of the United States. So you're saying, well, let's have Congress now be the judge of what the regulation does and what the regulator does. How about we have Congress do their job and actually clarify things that are not well understood in law, like what is in fact waters of the United States. And so where I wouldn't reject it out of hand, it just seems to me that every time we end up with a problem, we add another layer of review, when none of the review that we have so far has really accomplished a whole lot. So I have to leave. Thank you so much for being a great audience. We appreciate it. Good luck. Good luck, Susan. It's always good to see you. Good luck. We'll try to get you through.
Well, on behalf of the Federalist Society, thank you very much for joining us today, Senator. We'll now turn this over to the panelists for their prepared remarks. We'll go in the same order in which they ask their questions, and then we'll have time for audience questions. Begin with Susan.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Well, that was a tough act to follow, but I will try. So my job on this panel is to just set the stage for how did we get to where we are today. So I'll start with the first regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, almost 130 years ago. And since that point, the number of agencies and the activities that they regulate has been increasing. For the first 8 decades after the ICC, the focus of regulation was largely economic forms of regulation, where agencies would regulate the prices or the service quality or what firms could enter the a particular market, even whether you were allowed to get out of a particular market. And the concern that led to that was that there were these natural monopolies and that without regulation setting those prices, consumers would be charged too much. But what we learned was that those regulations, rather than protecting us from those natural monopolies, created some rather unnatural monopolies, so that the government regulations both created and sustained monopoly power, which ended up benefiting incumbents at the expense of consumers or new entrants, increasing costs and discouraging innovation. So in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, we actually saw a period of deregulation, where several agencies, including the Interstate Commerce Commission, were actually abolished, and the regulation in other areas were removed. And the results have been very good. We've had innovation in ways that really weren't even anticipated in advance, and lower costs for consumers and more choices. But at the same time that we had that deregulation in the 70s and 80s, it was a period of rapidly expanding regulation in a different area, what we call social regulations, or the environment, safety, and health type regulations. And those regulations, one interesting thing is they tended to be issued by agencies that were part of the executive branch, as opposed to the independent regulatory agencies, the commissions, multi-headed commissions that had issued the earlier regulations. Sorry. So we actually just today, or in fact within the last hour, those of you who are on our mailing list may have gotten an announcement about it already, just released a new report that tracks the on-budget costs of regulating agencies and the staffing involved in agencies. And our data, I do this every year with the Wiedenbaum Center at Washington University in St. Louis. And what we found is, so we have data that go back to 1960. So President Eisenhower's last budget to President Obama's last budget, we've seen a 20-fold increase in the spending, in the on-budget spending of regulatory agencies. And that's after taking account of inflation. And the staffing at these agencies has increased 5 times. So it's 5 times greater today than it was. And over the last 7 years, we've seen those economic regulations that we had removed largely in the 70s and 80s. We've seen a resurgence of that. So those are kind of the key takeaways from this report. And increasingly, there are various studies that are suggesting that the regulatory accumulation that we've been seeing may be contributing to the sluggish economic growth and the slowdown in the rate of technological innovation that we've been seeing since the 70s. So who's responsible for this state of affairs? And I just really, Senator Heitkamp's remarks were so great, I think, when she talked about Congress's role. But I'm just going to go through the 3 branches to think about who has been and who can hold this 4th branch of regulation more accountable. So Congress delegates its legislative authority to agencies. And as Senator Heitkamp said, they'll pass feel-good legislation that has broad goals that everybody can support so that they get credit with their constituents for passing legislation that will provide clean air or affordable care. But then they delegate the details to the regulatory agencies, often with tight deadlines, which short circuits the analysis and the public comment that's so important in getting a regulation right. And also with vague wording, as Senator Heitkamp said, that, vague wording and yet still constrains the factors that an agency can consider. And then when the agencies issue the regulations and their constituents don't like them, then they get to win again, as she said, by railing against the executive branch, the regulators, the bureaucrats who are issuing these regulations. So it really is kind of a win-win-win, and they don't have to take any responsibility. So now the judiciary, there have been several recent cases that have held agencies more accountable for analysis of the effects of their regulation. But judicial review is limited by deference to regulatory agencies, and something that Senator Heitkamp also mentioned, that regulatory analysis itself is often not subject to judicial review. So we have this combination of delegation from the legislative branch, deference from the judicial branch, and all of that leaves the executive branch holding all the cards when it comes to regulation. And the executive branch has taken the lead on regulatory oversight, requiring regulatory impact analysis, including benefit cost analysis. That has been embraced since President Carter. This executive office oversight, oversight from within the White House, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that several of us on this panel have been involved in over the years. That's been in place since Reagan. But the problem is they're all within the executive branch. And I will be the last person to say that the analysis or the oversight is not important, because I think it really is. But the checks and balances are missing when it's the same branch that is writing the regulations, that's overseeing them and making sure that they meet standards. And we rarely look back to see whether our projected analysis of regulatory impacts it was right, whether the regulations are recently having their desired impacts. The Senator's comments about the gaming rules I thought was just perfect. For those of you who weren't here yet, in North Dakota, she had the Gaming Commission rules were this thick. Was this how thick they were for $2 gambling? What did you say, Rick, this thick? And so she said, I think we probably don't need all these rules. And then they came back to 70 pages. So by looking back and seeing what's really necessary, they were able to stream like that. But we haven't been doing that. So we have this ratchet effect where regulations are increasing, and this is across administrations. It's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. We've seen this regulatory increase. It's all rather discouraging, but I'm going to end on a more positive note. To refer back to the exception that we've seen to this accumulation of regulation, and that was the deregulation movement of the 70s and 80s. That was bipartisan. President Carter, who built on lessons learned in the Ford administration and then continued on in the Reagan administration really brought about those changes. All branches of government were involved. The courts were involved. Senator Ted Kennedy led the charge from Congress on deregulating trucking and airline industries. I think what may be relevant there is the conditions. The economy was struggling. There was a big concern about inflation then, and an awareness that excessive and poorly designed regulation might be contributing to those economic problems. So they'd reached a point where there really was widespread agreement that something had to be done. And what I'd love to have us maybe talk about more today is, have we reached a similar point today where we can't ignore the negative effects of regulation on economic growth and consumer welfare and innovation? I thought Senator Heitkamp's response to your question, Michael, about whether there was any hope for the reforms that she has introduced, and she said certainly not before the election, maybe after the election. And what I maybe read between the lines was after the election if Trump is elected. She wasn't quite that explicit, but that might be a point where people say, yeah, we really do want some clear rules on what the process of regulation is. So,
Michael?
Thank you. Well, Susan has thoroughly impressed me, but I'll try to forge on. So a couple quick observations. First of all, I think I'll enlist Jeff in this as well. We're going to do a little bit of a Federalist version of a poetry slam up here. I don't have any prepared remarks. I'm not sure Jeff does either, but we were both inspired by Hamilton, who was a founding father, principally responsible for 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers, as we have all learned. So let me riff off a couple of things that Susan was saying, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about the challenges of passing reg reform legislation. First of all, I don't disagree with Susan that Congress has substantially ceded its role currently in being a part of the policymaking discussion and robust oversight over the regulatory domain. I think that's unfortunate. I won't sit here today and diagnose all of the reasons why, but I think it's critical that Congress folk of both parties are working together to solve the problems of the 21st century and to revamp and revise and modernize the rules, even the legislation, even in many cases perhaps pare it back where norms or evidence norms have changed, technology has changed, evidence indicates that it's no longer necessary. But that's not happening. So essentially what one has is 50 or 60 years of delegated authority, of statutory authority, much of which is quite prescriptive in its mandate to federal agencies, and you don't have Congress playing much of a substantive role in modernizing that. I think I'm not quite as black and white as perhaps Susan is on the role of courts. I was just jotting down the Interior Department fracking rule, Clean Power Plan, which has now surprisingly gone on bank immediately in the DC Circuit, the back and forth on mercury air toxics rule, the decades-long back and forth on CARE and CASPER, the waters of the U.S., imbroglio, which is still being worked out, PS detailing rule, where part of it was actually remanded, various ACA rulings. I mean, I don't get the sense that the courts are entirely sitting back and ceding all oversight over regulation. I think the Chevron doctrine is still alive. It is being, I think, chipped away at in various decisions in the Supreme Court. But I think there are various versions of hard look or close scrutiny given to regulations constantly by courts at the district court level and the circuit level and even certainly the Supreme Court. And that keeps the executive branch on its toes. I can tell you that when I was there, we spent a lot of time worrying about whether the rule would survive scrutiny in court and how we could ensure in its drafting that we stayed within the bounds of statutory discretion and that we followed the APA requirements. And so it's something that is attended to. I won't challenge the fact that more likely or not, and this is something that I certainly bring to my job at GE, where we worry about where rules are going and how they're shaped, that if you're left to the courts to solve your problem, you're probably a little bit behind the curve, let's say. I mean, you want to persuade an agency towards a better solution during the course of the rule writing process rather than leaving it to the end. And then the executive branch, which is holding all the cards. I think that on that I'll just say, look, there's plenty of bad regulation and poorly designed regulation. There's clearly a cumulative regulatory issue both at the federal level and, as the Senator mentioned, there's a local, state, federal cumulative issue that is particularly difficult to try to unpack. But when we do talk about the costs of regulation, I think all too often we don't talk about the benefits of regulation. If you want to compare, you know, the quality of air in this country, the quality of our water, the safety of our food, the safety of our medical devices, the safety of our vehicles, the safety of our air travel, et cetera, now versus the 1960s, I think there is a case to be made that there's been some marginal progress in a regulatory world. I had a colleague from Beijing, from our GE office, come over and marveled at, as you can imagine, marveled at the world we live in here, especially from an air quality environmental perspective. I mean, it's a completely foreign ecosystem to her, and I think the Chinese are about to get about the process of regulating their own society in a number of ways because they have to. Having said that, we all know that regulations can be poorly designed and that there can be real costs imposed with those, and that is why we've created, I think, a rather remarkable process in centralized review, imperfect, but net positive for sure, that has been endorsed by presidents of both parties. And we were just celebrating, Susan, thanks to your good offices, a 35th anniversary of OIRA and centralized review yesterday, which, as people like Boyd and Gray and Jim Miller and others who were there at the birth said, is a rather remarkable thing. That this idea started by Ronald Reagan has been strongly endorsed by presidents of both parties and has really become a part of the fabric of regulatory development. And I think that is one of its strengths, is it is sufficiently agile and malleable. I don't want that to be misinterpreted in a sort of pejorative way, but it's able to adjust itself to both a Democratic perspective and a Republican perspective without doing too much harm to the core process. And that has been one of the reasons why I think it has endured so long and has strengthened. In one of the presentations I give, we have measured the percent of rules that have changed going through OIRA review from '93 when the current executive order came into effect. And it's risen from something like half to about 90+% of rules that go through the OIRA process now are changed in some way. And I don't know what the precise reason for that is, but I would imagine that some of it is that institutionally, the agencies that are involved, the White House offices that are involved, the stakeholders who are involved understand that rules come in not fully finished and they benefit from an objective peer review, and that part of the process is actually that they change during centralized review, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's useful. Let me end by talking a little bit about reg reform and setting up Jeff Rosen, who I think is going to give you just enough about every regulatory reform proposal out there to make you dangerous at cocktail parties for the next few months. And that is to say that if one accepts the fact, as I think you have to, that the regulatory state is imperfect, everything in life is imperfect, and like any process, it can be improved and it should evolve over time to reflect our current society, our current levels of technology, the fact that there's been regulation for 50 years and we might have learned something or two. It has been remarkably hard to get congressional consensus, and then certainly the the chata necessary executive, legislative consensus around regulatory reform. And so when I look back at when I started my career in the regulatory space in 1995 with Sally Katzen at OIRA, you know, we were fighting over the Dole bill and the Thompson-Levin bill, and the compromise was CRA and SBREFA in the mid-90s. Here I am today, we're still thinking about whether we should codify the executive order. What is the role of judicial review? Does it create a super mandate across all statutes if one does that and one requires maximizing net benefits? It's the same arguments and same discussions that were being had over 20 years ago. If one looks at the suite of bills that Jeff's about to talk about, I think many of them are tailored, sort of center out, reasonable, very good faith efforts to look at the regulatory process and say, how can we improve it, and how can we improve it in a way that people of good faith from the left of the center line and the right of the center line can agree on, and we can pass it. And even then, it's incredibly hard to get Congress to move these even out of committee, let alone to the floor. And I think it is the truth that, you know, if the editorial board at the New York Times gets ginned up on what I would say is imperfect facts, they write an editorial, it's, you know, the support just sort of seeps away for the time being. So it really is a conundrum, I think, about how we form a consensus, a legislative consensus around reasonable regulatory reform. It's my personal view that if one were to pass some of these bills, that they wouldn't be vetoed by the president. I'm not sure the White House is going out of its way to support them through the process, but I find some of these bills to be improvements that even, you know, this president could not veto with a straight face. And so I think it's out there to be had, but I'd be interested in exploring with you guys what some of the, how we get across the finish line. I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A and our internal discussion up here.
Thanks. I did not get a chance to introduce our third speaker earlier while Senator Heitkamp was here, so let me just take a moment to do that. Our third speaker is my friend Jeff Rosen. Jeff's a partner at Kirkland & Ellis. He's chairman of the American Bar Association's section on administrative law. He's a member of the Administrative Conference of the United States, and he previously served as general counsel of OMB, senior policy advisor at OMB, and also general counsel at the Department of Transportation. And he's now a nominee to the Board of Governors of the Postal Service, so now you'll know where to direct your complaints. Without further ado, Jeff.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate that because we needed a break from Mike's upbeat assessment. But, unfortunately, as I heard each of you say that the previous speaker had a little bit of a downer note, I thought, well, how am I going to break that? But I don't know if I can. I'm going to try. My role on the panel is to give a very speedy overview of the actual bills that are pending in the Congress. And as I think most folks probably know, it's been 70 years since the passage of the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, which has been fundamentally unchanged since 1946. And there is lots of demand for reform, modernization, improvements to the regulatory process. Some of that, as Susan alluded to, is really driven by concerns as to whether the ways regulation have been done or the cumulative impacts of regulation have hindered the economy, economic growth, and in the current year, or the recovery. So there being a lot of demand, there are a lot of bills. Probably more than I could even hope to summarize. So what I did, and I hope there's a handout that was available that I provided ahead of the program, is I used just a screen of saying, well, which bills have passed the House, or, since none have passed the Senate, have been reported out of committee in the Senate and are awaiting floor action. And using that screen, there are 8 House bills and 4 Senate reported out bills. So that's 12. and that's excluding Freedom of Information Act bills that have passed both the House and Senate but are not identical. So using that universe, there's about a dozen bills in play. And what do they cover? I say in play, that just means that they're further along in the process. Whether they ever get to the finish line, you've heard numerous assessments this morning, none of which have been especially optimistic. But what do these bills cover? I'm going to try to quickly put those into 6 categories just to give you a feel for what they are, and then the actual bills are listed on the handout that I hope is available, and if not, will be after the program if you don't have it now. So category 1 are bills that try to address a particular aspect of the regulatory process about which there's a perceived problem. 2 examples: the RAPID Act deals with the speed in which permits are issued. It's been a big topic in recent years, but it's a particular part of the regulatory process. Sunshine and Regulatory Decrees, another bill that's passed the House, deals with providing public input and transparency when private parties or advocacy groups sue an agency and the agency enters into an agreement to do a regulation. That bill would address that particular problem. So category 1 are just, they're process reforms, but they're to go to a particular problem. Second category, codifying cost benefit and related requirements. You heard some discussion about that. That was an item that Senator Lankford and Senator Heitkamp have a bill, the Principled Regulation Act, I think it's called, in the Senate, that would basically codify the existing requirements. But then there are bills that do variations on that, extend them to independent agencies, or add additional analytic requirements, or add judicial review to existing analytic requirements. So cost benefit and analytic requirements is the second category. Third category, retrospective review of old regulations, comes up in a couple of different ways. The Scrub Act would create a 5-year independent commission to go through and scrub all the old regulations and come up with ways to remove them, either by a congressional vote or by creating a process called cut-go that would require agencies to cut rules to do new ones. So retrospective review, and there's a variant on that. Senator Heitkamp has a bill, Smarter Regulation, I think it's called, in the Senate, that would require new rules to be issued with a plan for how to do a measurement of metrics and evaluation to review it retrospectively sometime down the road. So third category, retrospective review. Fourth category are bills that would add greater transparency to what rulemakings are planned through mandatory requirements for disclosure and the regulatory agenda, and would create earlier public opportunities to participate. Examples would be the ALERT Act, which passed the House, which stands for All Regulations. Actually, I shouldn't have tried to say what it stands for, because now I don't remember. But it's the ALERT Act. A variation on that is that's a House bill that passed. The Senate bill, slightly narrower version, the Early Participation Act of Senator Lankford, would require advance notices of proposed rulemaking for all major bills that involve $100 million or more in costs or benefits. So it would create an extra stage of public participation. So that's the fourth category. Fifth category is what I would call comprehensive modernization of the Administrative Procedure Act. It has numerous pieces. That would be the Regulatory Accountability Act. Senator Portman is the lead sponsor on that bill, but it was introduced last year on a bipartisan basis with 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. And it does numerous things to improve the rulemaking process: stronger requirements for better data, more public input, restrictions on use of guidance documents, stronger cost-benefit requirements, and more judicial review. And then the sixth and final category I want to address is a different approach than these, and it's the requirement of congressional approval for major rules. And that's the REINS Act that passed the House I think in 3 consecutive Congresses, and it would basically modify the Congressional Review Act, which lets Congress try to veto rules if the president will sign the veto. It reverses it and says if it's $100 million or more, it doesn't go into effect until a fast-track procedure requiring a congressional vote of approval. And so that's the 6th category. Now, in the time allotted, I can't go through all the bills. I would say this, there's something to be said for nearly all of them, but there's not something equal to be said. They're not all equally good. So I wanted to just quickly give you sort of a range on what I'll call the practical aspect. The REINS Act is a good example of it's somewhat simple to understand. It's a congressional vote to have major rules go into effect. There have been, on average, 80 to 100 of those in recent years, so it would require 80 to 100 votes, at least in recent years. In that sense, easy to understand, but probably the hardest to pass. It passed the House, but on an almost completely partisan basis. Very small number of Democrats supported it. Kind of what I would call the middle ground, the Regulatory Accountability Act, probably does the most to improve the quality of the actual rulemaking process in the ways I outlined. But because it's a somewhat comprehensive bill, it also presents challenges. It seems to me it would be the one that might do the most good, might be the most valuable. And what's happened is a number of its pieces have been pulled out and made into smaller bills. And so that takes me to the 3rd aspect. Perhaps something like the ALERT Act, which is really just focusing on the transparency of rulemaking plans, requires the regulatory agenda to be updated on kind of an ongoing basis rather than twice a year that agencies put their rules, their planned rules on their website, requires various disclosures and earlier public engagement. That or a simplified aspect of just the ANPRMs on the Senate side are very modest pieces. They don't by themselves create major changes, but they do some incremental good. And so 3 different ways to think about reform. And I'll just offer one concluding observation, trying to be a little bit on the upbeat side. I don't know if it's very upbeat, but it's an effort. This year, for the first time in many years, the American Bar Association House of Delegates issued a resolution calling for modernization of the rulemaking provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act and endorsed several ideas that are contained in some of these bills. And so I viewed that as at least a hopeful sign that among various participants in the regulatory process, perhaps there could be a growing consensus that at least something needs to be done, and this is the landscape from which to discuss it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Now, in a few moments, we'll go to audience questions again, and again, there's a microphone in the middle of the room, so if you have a question, please line up. But in the meantime, I'd like to take a moment to let the panelists talk amongst themselves. Let me begin actually with Michael. You might have the most to respond to.
Yes, I'm enjoying myself immensely, and I'm going to throw another upbeat note here, right? So this year, we had permitting reform in the fall, which I think was bipartisan, real progress. I think that is a notable achievement, and I am hopeful that without in any way degrading protection, what it will do is it will streamline and expedite the ability for the country to develop infrastructure, which is of critical importance. I thought that was a great example of everyone coming around an idea. No one felt like they were going to lose one of their key equitable points, and they came up with a real rational compromise solution. I think TSCA reform is another victory which is always 1 week away for the last 8 months, but it looks like it's very likely that will pass. And again, that is an example of Congress, I think, reasserting itself, coming together in a bipartisan way around common sense ideas that have support from, or at least comfort levels that are, that skew towards neutral from the business community, from the NGO community. That's the space you need to operate in. I think the ANPRM proposals for major rules seem like they're playing in that same space. It's a prospective, retrospective review, which is an odd nomenclature, but the idea is that you build in a retrospective review, a methodology, a rubric, a timeline into the rule, into the major rule as you're developing it. That seems smart. Seems like a smart part of the rule design process. I think some form of non-binding, more analytical review of independent agency major regulations, that's been endorsed by academia, the ABA, ACUS, other sort of very technocratic, good government organizations. So it seems to me that there are a number of ideas out there that Senators Lankford and Heitkamp are pursuing that seem like good prospects for agreement, and that I find hopeful.
Susan?
I guess I always have thoughts, but Michael and I can talk another time. So.
Jeff, did you have anything further to add?
Just that I couldn't remember what the ALERT Act stood for, so now I felt obliged to look it up, and it's the All Economic Regulations Are Transparent Act, which is HR 712. Passed the House.
Mike, you promised us a poetry slam, and I'm still waiting. But
Yeah,
in the meantime,
listen, that's the way I roll. That's my poetry.
bring my Constitution
That's
and my
right, reform
rhyming
poetry.
dictionary.
Talking regulation is poetry.
All right, the first question.
Yeah, I'm Mike Doherty. I'm the CEO of LabMD, embroiled in a 7-year battle with the Federal Trade Commission. So, Mr. Fitzgerald, I am just speechless.
Fitzpatrick.
Or Fitzpatrick,
Thank you.
sorry.
That's okay.
Because I feel like I'm talking
You're going
about
to slam me with at least get my name
I think
right.
it's a playground built on a cemetery. And the question I have for everyone is really about the shiny object that everyone uses for pro-regulation, and how impactful is that in this lack of reform? You've got basically everyone in the system uniformly when the ABA says that we have to fix something, but the populace doesn't understand what goes on. So how do we keep them from destroying the brand, how wonderful regulatory is, because many partisans, if they don't have the government on their side, don't have a job. So we have the shiny object of, if we didn't have this, we wouldn't have clean water, and we wouldn't have all these wonderful things, which is not the problem, nor is it the point. But it's a very effective manipulator to get people to look away from the problem. So that shiny object, that manipulation that some people use today, and often use all the time when they want to not talk about this, how is that slowing down reform?
So I apologize. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, be real clear.
So you need to define for me what the
shiny object is starting the conversation on regulatory reform about how wonderful the regulations have been. I think I'm seeing political gridlock.
Right.
And I'm trying to figure out if the political gridlock is coming from the people that are voting for the politicians, buying the headline about the regulators, about how wonderful they are, and using fear. If we didn't have them, we would not have clean water, clean air, medical devices, which I worked at for 20 years. These are, to me, so far from the facts that go on, but they're used politically to diffuse the issue.
Maybe. So, first of all, I didn't say that all regulations are good.
I didn't say you said.
Okay, well, a little bit. Second of all, what I was trying to make a point, because I agreed that Susan has raised many good points, and I did want to point out that over the course of decades, Congress and the regulatory state have passed regulations, have promulgated regulations that do have costs, but they also have social benefits. There are externalities that have been internalized by those who produce the externalities, where there's been a market failure, and I think the record is, in my view, a net positive for our society. But I've spent 6.5 years in the trenches looking at rule design, and I've seen plenty of bad rule designs. I don't think it's the case that the American people are so stupid that they've been sold a bill of goods, that regulators are great, and that, you know, all this clean water and safe medical devices is just because of the regulators. I think in their core, the American people generally agree, as I think Senator Heitkamp was saying, that many of these regulations are important to improve their lives. Now, regulatory reform is by its nature a really wonky subject. That's why my poetry slam did not resonate with anyone in this room, and that was as good as I can do. This is inside baseball stuff, but it's very important because it goes to the process and the quality of the process by which policy is made. And so I think one of the challenges in regulatory reform is that nobody outside this room and a few people in Congress have any idea what we're talking about. But they are very susceptible to very partisan messaging on either side about what's happening, right? All regulations are bad, and those regulators are an uncontrolled fourth branch of government. And, you know, every single piece of reg reform is going to eliminate your regulations and is going to be used by business to destroy your lives. And I think that is a very unhelpful dialectic to have in this country. And I think it pushes people apart and not towards the center, towards real solutions.
Susan or Jeff, would you like to add anything?
No, there's a long, we have 2 minutes and a long line of questions. So.
Oh, the next question?
Richard Belzer. I have an interesting question, I think, for all of you. The area of where there seems to be the most bipartisanship in this field has been paperwork reduction. But paperwork reduction seems to be missing from anything that Congress is interested in doing, and for that matter, what OMB wants to do. Is that really dead? Is there really no interest in bringing the Paperwork Reduction Act back to life? Or is it just something that hasn't been attempted yet?
If people's eyes glaze over when we talk about regulation, talk to them about paperwork reduction, Rick. You know
Thanks,
that.
Rick. Really appreciate it.
So that would be my response. I'm not as familiar with what's going on.
I don't think there's a huge focus on the paperwork reduction because the cost savings aren't enough, but I think the paperwork reduction as a model for thinking about broader regulatory budgeting, I think there is something to be said, and the one kind of omission of all the bills I was going through today is that they don't address the topic of regulatory budgeting, and if you want to control the cost of regulation, there's an argument that the way to do that is to control the cost of regulation.
We'll go just 1 minute long. We'll take both of the last two questions, and the panelists can answer them together.
Sigal, there are obviously too many rules and too many laws and too much complexity. We can think of HIPAA, who was passed many years ago to make things simpler, and it results in over 100,000 committees to modify the HIPAA forms that we all sign when we go to the doctors every day. So my suggestion, my question is, why not simplify? Instead of all these different laws, have a simpler rule. Like every rule should have a purpose, a goal, something to be optimized, because there's something that has to be optimized, otherwise there should be no reason for the rule. They also require the rules explain their cost effectiveness. Right now, in many litigation issues and corporation management, we have the rule of reasonableness, the rule of this, the rule of that. Why not just simplify and make it official, the cost effectiveness across the land? And the last one, which is perhaps the most important one, making mandatory that for most rules, there should be the government, instead of just coming up with the rules, you should come up with a prototype implementation, which acts as a safe harbor. So instead of everybody, every corporation, every hospital having to come up with its own set of rules on implementation of the rule, the government proposes what to do, and then if you do it that way, then you have a safe harbor, you're not sued. So if we have these simple generic rules instead of all the laws to modify the rules, perhaps we will simplify the rules.
The Henry David Thoreau Reform Act, simplify, simplify.
Yes.
Well, one more question, and then the panelists can answer them both.
Thanks. My name is Ted Hurt. I'm just here individually as someone who studies APA law. I'd be interested in the panel's views about where to reside the studying of cost-benefit, whether prospectively, retrospectively, because some say Congress is not equipped to do it, some say the agencies don't have the resources and or there's skepticism of the agencies studying it, or does it go to some independent somewhere, which of course raises, I won't say delegation issues, but accountability issues?
Susan, would you like to take this first?
Sure, I'll answer them both. With respect to the first question, I agree with you fully on the simplify and the cost effectiveness. I'm not so sure about the safe harbor. I think that could have advantages, especially for small businesses. I would worry a little bit that it became that it would hinder innovation and experimentation. On the second question, I think that's also a great question, and I would say all of the above. I think Congress needs an office that has more expertise in regulation and has responsibility for evaluating effects. I think I'm very proud of OIRA. I think that it should continue and it should be bigger, but I also think academia, I think the more places there are looking at regulations, I think that the better outcomes and the more experimentation we'll have.
On that, I was going to. First of all, I think nobody can challenge the idea that the regulatory state is too complex and that there's too much accretion over time that has not been sorted through and resolved. And I think that's, you can be a believer in or a critic of the regulatory state, and I think you can still agree to that. How one fixes that, maybe we meet in the hall afterwards and talk further, because that is not an easy solution. On the cost-benefit expertise, look, I think, again, I'm a defender and promoter of the job that the civil servants at OIRA do, because I think it's still amongst the best of any organization in the world. Again, it can be always improved. They don't always quite get it right, but they do a very good job most of the time, and they absolutely net improve the state of regulations as they move forward. I think agencies probably need more capacity inside the agency. They're being asked to produce this. You can't always lean on 35 FTEs at OIRA to sort of kind of come together and figure it out. I think the agencies need more imperative to and more resources for that kind of analytical capacity within the agency. It's uneven. Some agencies are quite strong in it and some really aren't. And I think in a time of budget cuts, if this is something that Congress really believes in, maybe it's something where Congress needs to step up and actually appropriate funds for this kind of capacity within agencies so that there's more heft coming forward in the process.
No, I agree with what Michael just said, that I think OIRA does a terrific job, is the right place for it. But I also do think there needs to be a stronger capacity at some agencies. Some agencies are very good and others are not. I'd like to see that done with existing resources, but I agree with the premise.
Well, I'd like to thank our audience for allowing us to run a few minutes long on this. The next panels begin at 10:45, and thank you very much to our panelists.